Hello and welcome to the CS4 interview. Joining me this week is Doyne Farmer from the University of Oxford and the Santa Fe Institute, who's going to be talking about the complex challenges of sustainability. Doyne, thank you. Thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. Now, many people attending the talk today will have already known of you. You've been written in popular books, popular science books. You've had, I think it's fair to say, quite an illustrious career in complex systems simulation and complexity theory. I'm very interested in how you first arrived at, or first thought you wanted to pursue ideas in complexity, maybe even to a certain extent chaos theory, because you were one of the early adopters of the whole mathematical theory, right?
I was one of the early people. Like so many stories, it's a bit complex, but I'll try and give you a very shortened version. I've always been interested in this. I studied physics because this wasn't available. Had complex systems been on the curriculum, I would certainly have done that instead. I was always looking for an opportunity to think about these kind of things because I was always fascinated by evolution and the idea that society was evolving and everything's all intermixed and so forth. And then when I heard about chaos theory, I was actually working on beating the game of roulette, so I was very much primed to think about that because I was dealing with a deterministic system that was generating randomness. And so I jumped on that, dropped astrophysics, which is what I was doing at the time, and got involved with a group called the UC Santa Cruz Dynamical Systems Collective. I then went on to go to Los Alamos, and Los Alamos at the time had a lot of people thinking about these kind of issues on the theoretical division off on the side. And then in the late 80s, complex systems was kind of in the air. We were working in that direction. I organized a conference on cellular automata and one evolution games and learning, and I was doing machine learning and time series forecasting, and I got approached by the management saying, well, would you like to start a group in complex systems? I said, no, I don't want to be a group leader. And said, well, you better do it because otherwise we'll get that guy to do it. And said, okay, fine, I'll do it. And
classic management technique.
Yes, classic management technique. That was great, and I had a lot of great postdocs at the time, people like Chris Langton, Steen Rasmussen, Walter Fontana, Seth Lloyd, James Thyler, some very good people. And but then I decided to go start a fund, and because every time I would talk about my time series forecasting work, some clown would say, have you applied this to the stock market? And I got tired of saying no. And so we applied it to the stock market. I did an 8-year in the wilderness venture to create an automated stock trading system. And once I'd achieved my financial goals and discharged my obligations to the shareholders, I went back to the Santa Fe Institute. And since I had spent 8 years acquiring domain knowledge about markets, I decided to merge the domain knowledge I had about markets with what I knew about complex systems and devote my life to a new approach to economics. So that's what I've been doing now for about 12 years.
Okay. So I just briefly wanted to ask you about the environment of the Santa Fe Institute, let's say in the 80s or when you were there. Because when lots of people, when we come to these stories, they're secondhand. We read about them, and this is mythical place where these great people were all at the same time. What was the kind of working environment like?
Well, it was fantastic. At the same time, one shouldn't overestimate what it is or was. In the late 80s, it was a very small place. We were in a monastery, and there were typically just 4 or 5 people in the place at a time. So it was a small, intimate environment, and it depended a lot on who happened to be there at the time. I had the complex systems group up at Los Alamos, so we would arrange things so that the seminars were on Fridays. We'd drive down to Santa Fe and triple the number of people in the room. But it was a very stimulating place where lots of people blew through, and you could think about just about anything. And so I benefited a lot from it.
Okay. So the thing I always took from these kind of institutes is they're fundamentally multidisciplinary. So you've got people from a potentially very broad range of backgrounds. They might be thinking about the same thing, but they're coming from potentially very different perspectives. To what extent do you think that's almost like a necessary component of any centre or institute or place where we think about complex systems and complexity?
Well, I think complex systems is an inherently interdisciplinary endeavor, and it's very appropriate to do that. Complex systems means a lot of things to different people, many different things to different people. And so there's a notion of complex systems that's much more physics oriented and has a much more restricted domain set. There's a broader notion that SFI has embraced that includes things as widely ranging from physics to anthropology or history, archaeology. And I benefited and enjoyed enormously having that kind of interaction with a wide range of people. People often show up at SFI and they're not thinking about the same problem, but they start hanging out together, and after a month or two they are thinking about the same problem. And that's just the way things ought to work.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so today you're going to be talking about complex challenges on, let's say, sustainability, sustainable models of economic models, let's say. So you're not an economist, or maybe you wouldn't identify yourself as an economist, you don't come from the kind of the classically trained economist route, but you deal with a lot of them, okay? So we've had quite a few speakers just recently actually talking about maybe some limitations in mainstream economic theory, some of them more theoretical, maybe sort of mathematical limitations, the way that economics is taught at undergraduate level, let's say beyond, and perhaps even more worryingly applied in policy. So what I'm particularly interested in, what have your been experiences in taking ideas from, let's say, complex systems, and most notably agent-based models of economics, agent-based model of economic systems, and then taking that and talking it to, let's say, economists who work in a policy arena. To what extent have they been receptive, or what's been the reception like?
Well, it varies, and I think it's important to distinguish between the nuances of different groups. I would say that the mainstream of academic economists are quite resistant to the idea that something like agent-based modeling would be useful. They make a lot of criticisms which are valid, like that agent-based models are inherently very difficult to calibrate and validate. The estimation problems are very difficult, so it's hard to fit them to the real world. At the same time, I don't think they understand the benefits as they properly should. Now, that said, in other domains, for example, we're interacting a lot these days with people from central banks, and they're pretty open. I think in a very in an appropriate way. They say, well, okay, show me what you can do. They feel burned by what happened during the crisis, that mainstream economic models didn't serve them well in anticipating, understanding, and formulating solutions for the crisis. And so that's made them open to other ways of doing things. So I think there's actually a unique opportunity right now to make inroads.
So when you meet an economist for the first time, do you have a sort of agent-based model pitch? I mean, how do you describe an agent-based model to an economist who comes from maybe a potentially very, very different perspective, certainly mathematical perspective? Is there a thumbnail sketch you put together and try and explain how this thing works? Yeah,
I mean, I'm sure I don't do it the same way every time, but I'll give you an example right now. I think I pitched that the big virtue of agent-based models is that you're trying to use the real power that a computer has to simulate an economy with the institutional fidelity that understanding the economy ultimately requires. That is, the way the economy functions is very much shaped by the institutions that we've created. We learned that from lessons such as the downfall of the Soviet Union. A lot of mainstream economists say, well, capitalism will just, take over and they'll quickly do everything, and okay, it was fine for pornography and the mafia, but the rest of the thing of it, like banking and other key facets of economies, took a lot longer to take shape because institutions take time to build, and they don't just happen automatically. And agent-based models have the great virtue that institutional rules are easy to put in a computer and easy to simulate. So agent-based models can be much richer, much more detailed, and potentially much more accurate than the stylized mathematical models that economists typically make. The flip side of the coin is that agent-based models are only as good as the decision-making algorithms that are embedded in them. You have to put into computer code what a human being or what an institution will do in response to a changing situation. And so you have to have ways of making decisions that are moderately realistic. And that's hard.
Yeah.
And one should never forget that. I think, so that's the key focus, and that's, I think, going to be what determines whether we succeed or fail.
So that's going to be about getting hold of data, demonstrating the model validity, producing robust forecasts.
Yeah, you know, we're using a lot of different approaches to try and solve that problem. And the newness of the field is illustrated by the fact that many of these approaches haven't even been properly tried. So one obvious approach is simply sociology-style interview to acquire domain knowledge.
Yeah.
Ask people questions. How do you make this decision? What would you do under these circumstances? What have you done in the past? So you just try and encapsulate that and write down some approximation of it in computer code. Another approach, which is goes along in parallel, is acquiring microdata on actual decision making, historical data. Do we have, say, for example, an agent-based modeling project I'm working on under INET funding with Rob Axtell, John Giannakopoulos, and Peter Howitt, and a whole host of junior collaborators, we need to understand household dynamics. Well, we're blessed in that there are community surveys that are taken by the US Census where they go into households and ask them lots of questions, and in some cases even track them longitudinally through time. So those are really key, because then we can build models that are validated off of questionnaires about human decision making. Now, in the crisis project that I'm a part of, and maybe I can say more about later, we have built into the project the ability to do economic experiments. So in that case, we actually set up a laboratory situation and we see how people behave. In fact, we've designed the code so that the very same code we're using to simulate the model can be used to run experiments. And in particular, we can run our agent-based model, unplug one of our algorithms, put a person in place of the algorithm, and see whether the person is doing something similar to what the algorithm was doing in the full rich context of the rest of the model. In related, we're actually setting up an online game. In the online game, you get to be, say, a banker, and you compete against other bankers, where we simulate the rest of the economy, and you see how you do, and we take data about what you did. Finally, we're using so far internal competitions, but at some point we're going to have an external one, and also machine learning methods to have agents that are learning and competing using either machine learning algorithms and/or simply having a contest in which we have 5 groups competing with each other to create the bank that can run for 100 years and never go bust and make more money than the other banks. So we're using all these methods at once to try and cover the field, and so that makes me, let's say, I'm optimistic that we should be able to get something that is realistic out of this soup of different strategies.
Okay. I mean, this all sounds tremendously exciting, but I can also imagine someone not recoiling in horror, let's say, but where's my lovely, you know, that elegantly defined notion of utility, which I can optimize or something? Now you're asking people questionnaires. I mean, you've got this very fuzzy kind of data. Right. I can imagine there's a certain amount of resistance to just the very idea of going beyond what can be solved in closed form equations to maybe spreading out what it is that we think we know, or, you know, assigning uncertainties and probabilities to things. If, let's say, there will always be a certain amount of resistance academically, to these new approaches. What about in terms of like the policymakers? You mentioned bankers, but what about governmental or non-governmental organisations? Do they kind of get these new approaches?
I think they are intrigued by it. I think for most organizations to start using it, it has to be good enough to answer the questions that they need answered. And so, to take some other domains, there are examples of agent-based models in other areas. For example, traffic simulation. The city of Portland had itself more or less digitized, and there's a detailed agent-based model of all the traffic patterns. They can ask, if we were to put a bridge in here, how would that alter the traffic? And what would it do? What's the cost-benefit analysis? And I think that's proved to be enormously useful. In epidemiology, the state of the art now is, if you want to ask a question like, who should we vaccinate, under what circumstances, they go to the agent-based models.
Yeah.
There are also kind of network dynamical systems models. The two things operate in parallel, but for many kinds of questions, the agent-based models are very good because they can take things into account like the air traffic structure and deal with the time lags in a very precise way, and deal with diffusion of human movement and so forth.
Yeah.
So there are domains where policymakers are using these kind of tools. Economics so far isn't one of them.
Okay. It's interesting you mentioned infection models, because that's a classic example where you have one result using kind of an analytical technique which assumes, well, there's no spatial factors, but then you create an agent-based model which has got explicit spatial factors in there. You can get really very, very important different kind of results, which I think are being increasingly taken up.
Let me just say, I think in a sense the tension is between what is sometimes called structure and strategy. Economics is really centered around strategy in the sense that the whole notion of equilibrium, in particular Nash equilibrium in game theory, is centered around the question of you and I are both thinking agents, and I can think about what you're thinking, and I can anticipate what you're doing. How do we ever get out of the infinite regress? You're thinking about, I'm thinking about what you're thinking, and you're thinking about what I'm thinking. So we have a Nash equilibrium where we coordinate, and that should be where we go if we're both rational. That's all about strategy. And I think strategic decision making is very important, but economics, traditional economics, has sacrificed structure to strategy. So in order to get settings that are simple enough to solve the kind of equilibrium or game theory problems that they like to solve, they have to throw away a lot of the structure of the real world. And so you've got these competing things. Now something like traffic or epidemiology, they do involve people, but the strategic component is smaller and the structural component is huge. So it's very natural that those should be the first applications. It's more challenging to bring it into something like economics per se, where you've got the strategic part has a bigger component. That's the challenge we're facing.
About that, I mean, how strategic do you think the average person actually is? I mean, you've got notions of satisficing. We'll search along for some solution which is kind of good enough, but we don't. I would argue we don't spend a tremendous amount of time trying to maximize individual utility. So, I mean, are we not really very clever or very intelligent or very rational? Or how little rationality can you get away with when you're building an agent-based model of an economic system?
Well, so this is a big debate in the field, and I should say that economics has, in the last 10 or 20 years, come around to the notion, or at least many economists have come around to the notion that behavior matters and agents aren't completely rational. The problem is that the epistemology of the field, the whole way people formulate models, the style of model they're used to thinking about and building, is not, I would say, well suited to confronting the complexity of real behavior. And agent-based modeling, in contrast, I think makes a pretty natural partner. And so, but in order for that to happen, I think we really have to change the whole structure of how questions are posed, how they're answered, and what solutions are considered acceptable. and the whole style in which things are done.
Okay. So I want to talk a bit about complex systems applied to their structure, but also how different elements may be connected and interact importantly. So I teach a module called Global Challenges, which is about climate change, food security, energy security, and the kind of theoretical underpinning is that you can't simply address food security in isolation. It's intimately related to energy security and climate change. In order to make progress here, we need to understand how it's a kind of an element of a much bigger, admittedly complex problem. One of the challenges I find in teaching, and even to a certain extent communicating that, is that if you emphasize all the interactions, if you talk about new modeling approaches to capture the complexity in the interactions, what you can leave in somebody who's listening to you is just a mess. It's all this kind of tangled briar. Well, we can't make any sense of it at all then.
Right.
So let's not even bother. Why are you even looking at that? Why don't you do something which might actually be a bit more tractable? So agent-based models are an important technique to be able to approach this kind of complexity. But do you see, I mean, in the near term, are there effectively hard limits to what we can know, or how much progress we can make in these kind of civilization scale challenges that we have?
Well, I think doing a good job on these challenges is a big problem, and is going to take a long time to get really good solutions. Now, whether we can make progress over the short time scale that makes the models good enough to be useful is another story. Because the bar for what a useful model is determined by all the other models that are out there. And so if none of the other models are very good, the bar is not set very high.
Okay, yeah.
On the other hand, these problems are inherently difficult, which is why the bar is perhaps low. Now, I like to think that agent-based models should not be viewed as in direct competition with mainstream models, because I think it's likely that we'll find that what we're good at is not the same as what the other models are good at, and so I think there will be a long period of coexistence once agent-based models are established, which they aren't yet.
Okay, so there will be a certain period of maturation. We can't ask too much of them right now.
Can't ask too much at the beginning. It's a long, slow process because we're dealing with a hard problem. I think we were discussing that in weather prediction, for example, it took 30 years for the first weather forecasts in 1950 to arise at the point, which happened around 1980, where they were actually doing better than traditional weather forecasters who just predicted the weather using the method of analogs. In fact, I was in 1980. I was interned for a month with Ed Lorenz at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and I was camped out on the mesa, which I wasn't supposed to do, and I had to put my tent away in order to not get caught. But every evening I would go by, so it was a pain to put it up and take it down, so if it wasn't going to rain I didn't want to put it up. So I'd go by Ed's office in the evening and ask him for a weather forecast, and he was a good enough subjective weather forecaster, despite being also one of the great physical weather forecasters, that I would go by and he would either say, nope, it's not going to rain, yep, it's going to rain, or I can't tell. And within that, for a month, he was never wrong. But I think of that story because that was right at the point where the two things were crossing, and I remember having a discussion with him at the time and saying, well, we're now about even with the old-fashioned guys, and I think we're just about to pass them, and he was exactly right. Data strongly shows that. I think that's important to bear in mind when we think about agent-based modeling. It took 30 years for physical weather forecasters to beat their competition.
Okay, so that's, I mean, clearly that's going to be dependent on computational power.
Yeah.
But one of the worries that I have, so we have a doctoral training centre, we've got another 23 PhD students coming next academic year, so we'll have 100. And there is the belief, I know in some, that they've got all this computational power at their fingertips and they can just make an agent-based model or a simulation of anything, and somehow the output of that can be treated as, if not truth, empirical data, then they're building the model and getting a result, and that's kind of job done, there you go. Whereas in many examples or situations, that's just the start, right? Now we need to think about what does that actually say about the target system that you're interested in. For many systems, we've got good data sets that we can test them on. But let's say in terms of the complex interacting global scale challenges, the data's hard to find, and also there does seem to be a bit of a time issue in that we can't necessarily wait, or let's say we've got kind of pressing issues over the next, say, decade, certainly within the century or so. So how optimistic are you that we will actually be able to develop the tools, gain the insights, have explanatory power in order to be actually do anything about these issues? In order to be able to
well, you know, we're already doing something about the issues. Climate models add substantial value. And while, as I'll say in my talk a little later, I don't think the economic models are adding a lot of value, they at least have focused people's thinking on the problem. And so I think one has to bear in mind that the models are always going to be imperfect, and it's just a question of how imperfect. So I think we can immediately make useful progress that will contribute in a useful way to the dialogue and to the decision making. You know, whether in 100 years we'll reach some point where we can simulate everything extremely well, I don't know. I mean, there's a Red Queen phenomenon because the world is getting more complicated, and as our ability to simulate it gets more powerful. I agree with something you said before. Let me just spin it in a bit of a different way. Data is the big limiting factor, ultimately. We are surprisingly poor at collecting data about ourselves. I think of this in particular because one of my projects that I'll say a little bit about today later, but and it's actually very relevant for this whole issue, is understanding technological progress. Because the correct response for global warming depends very much on forecasts about technological progress of different technologies, and how fast can we arrive at, say, green energy production with how many dollars do we have to spend to get there? Well, you would think that we would have infinite amounts of data on technologies and their performance and their types and so on, but such data is actually hard to come by. A postdoc of mine, Bela Naj, spent 3 years collecting such data just to allow us to write one paper. I would argue we know a lot less about the technologies that we have built ourselves than we know about fossils in the Cretaceous period. You know, in other words, life in the Cretaceous period, we devoted enormous number of man years to assembling every little shred of evidence and sifting through it very carefully. Linnaeus and his followers have spent hundreds of thousands of person years collecting organisms and classifying them and debating which category they go in and so on. Technology, almost nothing. So we have to have that data if we're going to understand those questions.
I mean, part of the problem surely is that the rate of change is so tremendous, is that maybe what we know now is out of date, but then you would seek to extrapolate and at least get some.
I think the problem is actually more basic than that. It's disdain for the familiar. You know, it's all right there. We take it for granted. Somehow it doesn't occur to us that if we don't keep track of things, then we won't have it later on. I mean, we would, for example, love to have an assembly of all parts catalogs for tools through time, just to see what are the tools, how did they proliferate, how many were sold, how did they evolve, how did they change, what factors drove those changes. Very hard to assemble that kind of data. You know, we're actually working with a data set from the US Patent Office that it's one of the few examples of this kind of thing. We have 9 million patents, 160,000 technological codes since 1790. But this is one of the few data sets, and it's frustrating because all you have are patents. You don't have information about their economic significance. You're missing all kinds of things you would really like to have.
So, I mean, what would be the solution then to get more people, more institutions, organizations, companies to buy into making their data public, to sharing their data?
More data sharing, more funding towards acquiring such data. Economics, on one hand, economics is a data-intensive field, but they've exerted, up until now, I would say, much too little effort on gathering and processing microdata down at the finest level. Most economics is done with highly aggregated data sets. And so as a modeler whose natural instincts are to go to the bottom and get right down to the atoms, it's a frustrating thing.
Okay.
I mean, I think a key point about complex systems is that it sits on top of reductionistic models, right? Ultimately, if in complex systems, we're asking how emergent phenomena come out of the interactions of components. But we have to understand what those components are and how they interact in order to quantitatively study that. So we're sitting on top of the underlying reductionistic models. And it's hard to make those models if you don't have data at the level you need to see how the individual components are actually, what they are and how they're interacting.
Yeah, if you can't build the model of the actual particles, then
yeah.
So part of the challenge is to make the mundane more exotic and exciting.
Yeah.
We empower and enthuse people to go out and collect the data.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and get leading economists to lean on government officials to allow the data to even be collected. Unfortunately, things like, on one hand, I'm completely in favor of confidentiality and privacy and so forth, but it gets in the way of a lot of science, because oftentimes the things are perceived to conflict. And while I think there are ways to do this kind of research without infringing on anybody's confidentiality, agencies are often understandably reluctant to let that happen.
Yeah, certainly a potentially sensitive issue.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you again for agreeing to come and give a talk and interview. I look forward to your talk immensely. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you.